Hi there, Glocal citizens. Welcome back to the podcast that inspires a borderless mindset around manifesting a new world. I am your host, Florence Adu, coming to you from a cool raining season, Accra evening. It's been a quiet day, lots of breezes, and I somehow kind of enjoy this, but I do have some FOMO because I'm missing my New York, US, Western Hemisphere summer. But soon enough, I'll be there, so I won't have to be FOMOing for much longer. And today I have a guest that really speaks to the ethic of citizenship. And so I'm really excited for this conversation. You'll learn more about the organization and how it operates. It was lovely to get approached by one of his volunteers that is really the spirit of all of this. So let me get to his bio and we'll take it from there. He is an AI technology executive and military veteran. He founded the Digital Democracy Project, an accountability system and mobile voting platform that connects voters directly with their legislative representatives to address systemic problems in the electoral system that result in hyper-partisanship and widespread voter alienation. To achieve better outcomes, he believes technology can be used as a catalyst for building a more modern, inclusive system of government, giving greater control directly to voters. Ramon Perez, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. That was a very kind intro as well.
Oh, my pleasure. So let's get started. Let's jump right in. Where are you from? Where are you local? And what is your craft?
I grew up in Florida. I'm in Florida currently, although I split my time a lot in Washington, D.C. As you said, I was a military officer for many years and left active duty to go back to graduate school and then got into AI and machine learning about 12 years ago and have been doing that as my day job. Sort of stood up Digital Democracy Project as a nonprofit organization in the period after January 6th, actually. So I had this sense that we'd been spending 20 years trying to build democracies in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm a veteran of both conflicts, and that feeling that it was starting to fall apart right here at home. And what could I do to take the skills that I'd been developing in technology and put them to work in reforming democracy? So that's the genesis of our project.
Okay, so let's go to the 101 of it all. How do you define democracy?
Well, in our case, we're actually saying we want people to weigh in on every piece of legislation that's being debated on our behalf. We want a citizen-led, voter-driven system of government where people have a voice all the time. We're trying to create something like the Netflix of government, where we use highly secure mobile voting software that's being used in real elections, but we're using it for different purpose. We're loading legislation that's being debated in Congress and in our state capitals and saying, why don't we verified voters who can be verified by photo ID matching a selfie and they're on the voter file, let them have a say in the process continuously rather than once every couple of years at election time. And that's, I suppose you could say, our view of a 21st century voter-driven version of democracy. What we currently have is I guess you could argue, a semi-representative democracy. I mean, it's called a representative democracy, but in so many ways, the system has been designed by the two political parties to carve up the maps in order to not have to hear from all the voters through the process of gerrymandering and through the process of ballot access rules. A lot of independent and third-party candidates can't get on the ballot. So it's not truly representative in the sense that most voters actually don't have any real say in a general election in November because they live in a district where one party controls that district so completely that the general election is not even competitive. It's really the primary election where the party chooses its own candidate that determines the outcome. So for most Americans, they don't actually get to live in a truly representative democracy. We need to fix that, and we now believe we have the technology that can help us reform that system.
Thinking about voters and or knowing that we believe would be most effective is that people actually have a say in the representation. What would you define as civic responsibility?
I think at a minimum, I've voted in every single election in which I was eligible from age 18, and I believe fervently in that that is a responsibility of our citizenship. But I also acknowledge the fact that people increasingly feel disenfranchised by this system, and for good reason. I mean, it's in a lot of ways it's designed so that the legislators in power basically get to choose who to listen to by designing the districts in which they run for office. So voter apathy in some ways is not unexpected outcome of a systemic problem in the way that the incentives are designed. We allow the people running for office to choose the mechanism and the maps in which they get to run for office, which is an inherent conflict of interest that is leading to all sorts of the hyperpartisanship that we currently see. So if we talk about what is a citizen's obligation, I still believe that a citizen's obligation is to educate themselves on government, understand who's running, and vote, right? I still believe in that quite fervently. But I guess you could say in the last several years that we've been involved in this project, I increasingly understand why people feel like there's no point when they've been carved out on purpose.
Right. Absolutely. I absolutely get that. When you think about how that has shaped the project, right? Because you mentioned something about voters informing themselves, but that's a key piece of what your project does. So tell us about how you support educating voters about the issues, about what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think education is a key element of what makes this possible. And we have legislative policy analysts who track which bills are being debated in Congress or in the state capitals, which ones are likely to come up to a vote, which ones are getting committee assignments, so that we can put those into the mobile app and inform people that a vote is coming up on these key pieces of legislation that are they're likely to pass, or at least they're going to have a debate, because that triage process is important. When people feel overwhelmed, it's because they go to a state legislature website or they go to congress.gov and they see that there are literally tens of thousands of bills that get drafted in any given session, and then there's dozens and dozens of motions and votes, and the parliamentary procedure is overwhelming. So if you don't really understand how the mechanism of legislation works, it's difficult to know how to focus your attention, what matters and what doesn't, and what to spend your time educating yourself on versus which bills are most likely going to die in a committee or never even get that far in the first place because they don't have the right co-sponsors. So part of what we are trying to provide is just helping triage that process for people and putting them into the mobile app once we feel like the bill is mature enough that it is likely going to come up for debate or come up for a full floor vote, so that then they can say, okay, well, these are the things I should focus on. And we've also really heavily leaned in the last couple of years because, we started at the beginning doing all of this manually. We would write summaries of the bills manually because, again, the legislation is incredibly esoteric. The language is complex. It's written by lawyers for other lawyers. It's not really designed for us, to be honest. And so our team would read the bills and write summaries that would be in plain language for people to understand what the bill is about. AI has given us an incredible capacity to do that much more quickly and efficiently, so that the exact same team can actually now do 10 times as many bills, because the language models take a first cut at reading a 1,500 page, one big beautiful bill omnibus and summarizing that. And then our team can just review the summaries and make sure that it's factually accurate before we publish it. So we still have a human in the loop in that process, but yeah, absolutely, education is a key part of this. We need to help people understand what to focus on, and then help them understand in plain language what the bill actually does, and if it and also which organizations support it or oppose it has been something that people have really appreciated. That we go out and try to scour the internet to figure out which organizations are supporting a bill, which organizations have taken a position on a bill, because that serves as a proxy. If they, if they align with that organization or opposed to that organization, it gives them some insight into who's behind it. So I think those types of things are important. A lot of it is really just synthesizing this data that exists out there, but packaging it in a way that is easy for people to understand, as well as then seeing how their legislators voted on the bill, what votes took place. Because oftentimes, yes, That exists on Congress.gov. That exists on your state legislature, but it can be deeply buried in many, many layers of parliamentary language that makes it difficult to understand. What was the actual up or down vote on this bill? Did it pass or not? And who voted for it?
This makes me think about going back to the beginning. So you mentioned why you raised the project. And so it's kind of my why the where question. So how did you go about figuring out that this was the project that was going to be the work of really influencing democracy in the United States and abroad? Because I think there's other traction that you're seeing in other regions. So what were the foundational steps of thinking about how you formed the team and thinking about what exactly were the inputs to what the project now offers?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think it's because going back to 2016, really became interested in this problem of gerrymandering. I really do think it's the smoking gun of voter suppression in a lot of ways. And trying to figure out what are the ways that you could deal with that, and got involved with a project called One Virginia 21 at the time, which was around independent election commissions and trying to get independent drawing of maps that is not beholden to the legislators who are in power. That, I mean, it comes around, right? Because basically during this process of redrawing maps mid cycle that we've gone through as a result of essentially Trump and Texas Republicans starting a brand new process of drawing new maps, and then all these Republican and Democratic states following suit. Well, Virginia went through a process of basically trying to undo the, I thought, very good reform work that I and others had been involved in creating independent election commissions, and California undid, so you can see how quickly, given the political change in the wind, that it's quite quick and easy for legislators to say, let's change this, and because we now want to rig the maps again, so we're going to go and undo this good work, right? So I think that becomes an example of why it is very difficult to deal with that inherent conflict of interest. As I say, if the people who write laws are also the people who run for elections following those election laws, it's like the players on the field also serving as the referees. It's a conflict of interest that becomes a real problem. And so the more time I spent trying to understand these systemic problems in our election system, the more I realized that you really need to find a mechanism where you can go straight to voters and give power back directly to them. And if we look at what technology has done well over the course of the last 150 years, a lot of times what it does well is it reduces information asymmetry, which is what AI, I think, is going to do in spades, and what we're showing already that we can do that, making very difficult knowledge easier to get and understand. It also connects buyers and sellers like Uber or Airbnb. And in our case, that is removing middlemen that stand between the voter and the representative. There are plenty of representatives who want to be good servants of the people, and they just have a really, really hard time getting accurate input from their voters, because really they're inundated with emails that are now predominantly spam or form filled and now AI generated emails. So they don't know what to believe. They can't validate that the person who's calling them actually lives in their district or is entirely fake, or even a deep fake at this point. So the veracity problem is a real challenge for legislators who actually do want to hear from their voters. And for voters, the voters feel like if they can send an email, they can write a letter, but it goes into a black hole because the legislator has no obligation to publish that information. In fact, Congress is specifically exempted from Freedom of Information Act requests, so they're not legally bound to say how many people called into their office supporting a bill or opposing a bill. And they can obfuscate that if it doesn't align with what the party wants or what some lobbyist wants or what their personal agenda dictates. So what we, I think, can do with technology is we can solve that problem of verifying people, that we can verify that they're real human beings. There's a whole blockchain backend, so we can verify that the vote that's cast is the vote that's counted. And we can also solve the problem of transparency and accountability, where what voters feel about a given piece of legislation or public policy is transparent and it's published for everybody to see. There's no hiding that. And everybody has access to that, journalists, voters, legislators, policy experts, whatever. But then we also go a step further and we say, well, voters gave you this input prior to a vote in Congress. So we're going to compare what do the voters want in the app and what do the legislators actually do on the floor of the legislature to see how often did people match, how often did legislators match what their districts wanted from them. So every legislator gets a scorecard that shows, are they doing a good job representing that district? So I think that technology really gives us those key pillars. It's verifiability, accountability, transparency, and security. Those are all really important to making this process work. And it wouldn't have been possible even 5 years ago.
Which begs me to ask you the question about how does a young man who was in the military find himself as an AI executive? So tell us about that career path and how that then, sets you up to be in this role to now marry the practical with the technical.
That's really interesting. I think I could say that I've had a very circuitous path. I don't know that I've ever, I don't know that any of my career planning has actually resulted in what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I studied engineering as an undergraduate. I was a junior in college on September 11th. I had intended to be designing airplane engines. I had been doing internships at Lockheed Martin, and my plan was, that was what I was thinking of as my future. And I think September 11th changed all of that. I ended up going into the military, becoming an intelligence officer, and focusing entirely on counterterrorism, and served in Iraq and Afghanistan, a couple of deployments in South America. And after essentially the bin Laden mission, where it felt like a good bookend to me, that I had gone to serve because of September 11th. We had found and eliminated Osama bin Laden. And so now it's time for me to move on with the rest of my life, right? So plus I figured, okay, this war in Afghanistan is going to wrap up anytime now. So what's
Right.
how naive. It was another 10 years after that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so then I decided to go back to graduate school, and this was in the period post the market crash, 2008, 2009, and I became very interested in economics, and I decided I wanted to be an economist. And so I went back to graduate school for studying economics and finance. And interestingly, one of my professors, he was a vice president at a company, which was the company that I worked for, called Elder Research, and they had a project with the Securities and Exchange Commission on studying credit default swaps and counterparty risk and identifying people trying to manipulate markets in the credit default swap market. And so that really was very interesting to me. And he said, well, like, what do you know about machine learning? And I was like, I never even heard of it. He goes, well, you basically take a lot of your Java development that you did as an engineering student, as an undergrad, with a lot of your financial markets modeling that you're doing as a graduate student, and marry those together. And that's basically what we're doing. And so everything I learned about machine learning and AI, I effectively learned on the job, starting in that project and surrounded by some very, very talented people who taught me a lot. And now I've been at it about 12 years. And so I really just fell into it. And I got very lucky, to be honest. I think that the things don't, always go to plan. As like, what is it? The Rolling Stones say, you can't always get what you want, but if you try, sometimes you get what you need, right? And I think that
Right.
I had intended to stay on in a PhD. I didn't get picked up for a research grant. I was looking at the cost of having to pay for this out of pocket, and then and then one of my professors kind of threw me a lifeline, and he's like, hey, come check this project out. And I think the rest is history. It's been amazing because I've learned so much, and the field is evolving so quickly, and it's very, very exciting time to be working with these types of tools. And I think what's interesting to me is that kind of observing how, having been at it 12 years, obviously people have been working on it longer than that, but to me, it feels like a gradual evolution of the technology. To the general public, it feels like it sort of exploded onto the scene all at once when ChatGPT went live in 2022. And I have been a bit surprised at some of the reaction to that, where there's so much fear and anxiety now around AI which I think I do understand in the sense that I understand people's concerns about fake, everything is fake. One of the things that I think we need to think about is that the tools themselves are not moral or immoral. The tools are just tools. J. Robert Oppenheimer developed an atomic bomb with incredible killing power, and he regretted that the rest of his life. But it turns out that since World War II, no atomic bombs have been dropped again, and yet we've had 80 years of successful civilian nuclear power usage with zero carbon emissions, right? So there are good and bad in these tools, but it's ultimately to the person behind the keyboard and that person's sense of moral purpose. And that's exactly what we're trying to prove with this project, which is that the tools themselves can be used for good. We have a mechanism here where we can build a greater, more accountable system of democracy for the 21st century. And we can design the type of participatory democracy that our children and grandchildren will inherit from us. And I think that's what is very exciting to me about what these tools can deliver.
Yeah. So speaking of tools, you've been in this, I think it's that sweet spot, because I remember when machine learning and big data were emerging on the scene as real conversations back in 2012, right? So around then it was starting to emerge, and I felt like this is some kind of wonderful opportunity that will do that equalizing. And now we have this proliferation of, okay, different types of AI tools. And so what do you think is amongst these tools, amongst these different types of, levels of what the AI is or what the technology tools are, the most important innovation that you have been able to integrate into your project?
Well, like I say, for the purpose of serving the public, there has been no greater addition than the ability of a large language model to read many thousands of pages of legislative text and summarize it in plain language. I mean, that's incredibly powerful. It makes me think about the Gutenberg Bible, right? When suddenly the cost of producing a Bible was drastically reduced by the printing press. And now suddenly the proliferation of knowledge, because books were so much cheaper, but because the Bible specifically, there is a whole cadre of bishops and clergy whose job was to interpret the Bible and translate it between God's will and the public. And so the public had to rely on that intermediary to understand the will of God according to this text. Once the Bible became cheap and readily available, you had this explosion of different interpretations of biblical knowledge, which basically became the Protestant Reformation and the schism in the church and all these kinds of things. It was an incredibly important technological advancement that led to a massive change in civil society. I don't mean to overstate it, because for most people, they're getting silly cat videos or recipes for
Right.
for better risotto or whatever. But I think that I think that the ability to make knowledge, especially esoteric knowledge, more easily attainable is incredibly powerful. And I think that's what we're going to see what AI can do, but it allows us to say, well, why do we have all of these intermediaries standing between us and our government? Where before we had the sense that we send people to Washington because they're smarter than us, or they can take the time to read the bills, or they really understand public policy, or they can handle all these trade-offs and debates and negotiations. And I think we've watched the pillars of that argument crumble over the course of the last several
Yeah.
decades,
Yeah.
right? And now I think people are disillusioned enough in that theory, the Schoolhouse Rock interpretation of Congress, that people are now at a point where the demand for something new is real and it is tangible. And now it's down to building the technology and deploying the technology in ways that give people some agency again in the process.
So I was anticipating you might talk about blockchain. And that is because it feeds into the Votes app. And so that kind of takes us into this international sphere of where it's actually being deployed, and in some places in the United States. So tell us about that. Tell us about Votes, and tell us about how that is another evolution and improvement on this process of democracy.
Absolutely. I think it's Votes is a fantastic partner. They're a for-profit organization. They build mobile voting software. We're a nonprofit organization, so we're really just using their tools and stitching it together with all the other tools to make our process work for legislation. But they designed the Votes mobile app for military voters overseas to vote from their phone in cases where it's difficult to get an absentee ballot through the mail. So if you're in a submarine under the ocean, you don't get good mail service there.
Right.
So it's
Go
really tough to
figure.
get. Yeah, it's tough to vote. And actually, military voters actually have some of the lowest turnout rates. Military voters overseas actually have lower turnout rates as a result of how difficult it can be to get paper ballots through the mail on time and get them stamped on time, according to the 3,000 counties that actually have rules around when they can vote and how they have to vote. So it was meant to be a niche technology solution to solve that problem. It was built on blockchain mainly as a security tool, because the concept with blockchain is that no one super admin developer controls the keys to the database and could manipulate votes. It's a decentralized ledger. It's just that there's no cryptocurrency involved, but it's the same basic technology as how Bitcoin works, which is that if you think about Bitcoin, it was meant to replace banks as an intermediary. The bank has a central database of all the transactions that have occurred, and their job is to keep track of how much money is in your account and debit when you spend something and credit when you bring in money. And that's their job, and they earn a lot of fees for doing that work, right? So the concept with Bitcoin was that, well, could you design a financial payment system with no banks involved? And how you do that is you have multiple replicas of the accounting ledger that exists in a bunch of computers all over the world. And the Bitcoin miners, when a new transaction comes on, their job is to verify the authenticity of that particular transaction in order to put it onto the blockchain. And they all have to agree that every single copy of the ledger has to be identical in order for it to get added to the blockchain. And they get paid for that in the form of Bitcoin, in cryptocurrency, right? So Votes uses what Hyperledger Fabric, which is a private blockchain. And so the way they do it is you have independent auditors, including some government intermediaries, and even I think in some states where they're operating, they have the political parties act as independent auditors. So you have opposite points of view clearly politically, and they're both validating that that the ledger is correct in that process, because it requires everybody to agree in order for a vote to be added to the blockchain. So that system of competing incentives is what ultimately can guarantee fairness. So when you, as a voter, download the Votes app, you have a cryptographic token that is created. You have to go through a process of scanning a selfie, matching it against a driver's license or a passport, then we get the voter file from the states, and so it checks against the voter file. So if all of that is true, so we can know that you're a U.S. citizen, that you're a real human being, that you're a resident of that particular district, then as you read over a piece of legislation, in our case, or if you're reading a ballot in, let's say, Utah or Arizona, the states where they're operating, and then you make your decision, there is a biometric scan as well. It checks your face to make sure it's still the same face. So as you submit your ballot, it's authenticating you again. And if it matches, a vote token is added onto the blockchain, and it is encrypted as well, using a system called homomorphic encryption, which it's actually a newer type of encryption that allows calculations to be performed against encrypted data without having to decrypt it. So you can actually add votes together without needing to decrypt the record itself. So that's a key addition to what makes this kind of thing possible, because what's unique about voting is that you have to protect the secrecy of the ballot. You don't want people to have their ballot manipulated, right? Or you don't want people to be bribed in order to vote one way or the other. The secret ballot, has been around for about 120 years now, mainly for that purpose, to prevent coercion and bribery. And we want to protect the secret ballot, but at the same time, you need the security and authenticity of knowing that that person is who they say they are. So that's what makes mobile voting or online voting one of the more difficult cryptographic challenges. And end-to-end verified voting, homomorphic encryption, blockchain, all of these things are the key components that can make that possible in a way that is secure and still delivers the inherent flexibility and accessibility of being able to vote from your phone.
And so when you think about globally where democracy is working, with these tools, and then this is an adaptation that could be valuable everywhere, right? Because what I observe is that, the US has its own special, mix of the way that democracy is being degraded. And around the world with different structures of government, we are starting to recognize that the people and their votes and their voices are being basically ignored. When you think about what you've seen as comparative examples, where is democracy actually working well?
Well, I think there are some interesting examples we can learn from. For one, Switzerland has been using direct democracy effectively for a century now, I believe it is. So they have ballot referendums on pretty much anything. And maybe it's an apocryphal story, but a colleague of mine returned from Geneva and he said he was getting his hair cut and he was amazed that the barbers were talking about how much money should be, they had some sort of referendum coming up on the defense budget and they were trying to decide how much money should be spent on the Joint Strike Fighter or something like that. And he's like, he was just blown away. He was blown away by that. If you have developed a culture where everybody has access to participate, then I do think that people will step up and fulfill that civic responsibility, either out of curiosity or out of a sense of just common purpose. I think if you have a system where you expect very little of people, you're going to get very little in return, and then it becomes self-fulfilling, and everybody goes around saying, "Oh, Americans, they don't care about this kind of stuff. They're not interested in public policy. They want the food fight or they want the drama." And I think that becomes very self-fulfilling. Another good example would be, I think, Ireland in the period following the Irish Civil War introduced ranked choice voting. So this is in the 1920s.
Mm-hmm.
And they did so because they needed to try to balance the competing interests of Protestants and Catholics, of Republicans and of monarchists, essentially, like that were causing so much bloodshed and violence. And ranked choice voting has been very successful in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, for 100 years. And contrary to that, Northern Ireland maintained the first past the post election system used in Great Britain and had decades of the Troubles and violence and car bombs in Belfast and all the things that we think of with the Irish Republican Army and everything that ensued. And so much of that is because if you are not obligated to represent 51% of the electorate, if you can win an election, especially if there's a 5-person race, and you can win an election with 25% of the vote, you have an incentive to cater to the most extreme voices. And that creates the kind of political chaos and dysfunction which can lead to violence. The kind of violence that we saw on January 6th, that we've seen in a variety of places throughout the country. And that can be left-wing violence. It can be right-wing violence. It doesn't really matter. The point is that if people don't have a legal and legitimate mechanism for airing their grievances or petitioning their government, they will resort to
other
extrajudicial means, right?
Yeah. So I like how you spoke about the barbershop talk in Switzerland. This is where I'd like to ask you about Glocal speak. So we want to hear what you hear. You can share a word, a phrase, or a saying that is a meaningful part of your local experience and why or how you consider it to be Glocal speak.
I think the word that comes to my mind is transparency. I think that people are willing to acknowledge that there are real trade-offs in democracy, that not everybody's going to get their way, that there are going to be times when you're on the winning side and times when you're on the losing side. And that's just the way it goes when you've got 320 million people with differences of opinions. I think what people want is this feeling like the process is open and visible and transparent, and it's not being manipulated behind the scenes by powerful political brokers who don't have their interests at heart. And increasingly, we can't even talk about billionaires anymore. We talk about trillionaires, that feeling that incredible wealth also accumulates with incredible political power, and it becomes self-fulfilling. So that people sort of achieve an escape velocity where they're no longer bound and tethered by the laws of our common humanity. I think that's what people look for when, and so much of what we try to design in our project is around a mechanism for introducing real transparency, and accountability comes from that transparency. You can't hold legislators or the process accountable if you don't actually get to see what's going on.
Absolutely. So I want to talk again a little bit more about the organization as it functions. A lot of what democracy is about organizing people and the activism of getting people to be present and be a part of it. So as you were forming the project and as you operate the project, how are you attracting talent, retaining talent? Just, operating a not-for-profit is not an easy endeavor. So tell us about the kind of operational side of running the project.
Yeah, I mean, we've been an all volunteer team, and we rely on volunteer software developers and legislative analysts and organizers and folks who can help us spread the word. People like you and independent media. I think so much of this is a community effort. It is going to take all of us to acknowledge that this democracy belongs to each of us, and if we want it to still exist, we've got to take our own small part and add up to the greater whole. So I think we've been very lucky in the sense that we try to just put the vision out there and let people who resonate with that come and find us and lend their talents and however they see fit. Some people write us check. We've had people put a $5,000 check in the mail. Somebody we'd never even interacted with before, but they just said, "I like what you're doing. Here you go." And that kind of thing. I think we need participation in all ways, large and small, in order to make this work, because to create true change, we're going to have millions of voters in all 50 states participating. And we're going to need to see also candidates running for office on this new idea. And now we're starting to see that. Now we've been at this for 3 years, since essentially 4 years. And we've got legislators who've endorsed the project. You can see them on our supporters page. And we've even got some legislators. We've got a guy, named Dan Williams in Central Florida, who's running for Congress on a direct democracy platform. He's basically saying, I'm going to be a pure avatar of the people. As long as, more than a certain number of people actually interact on, engage on a particular bill. He's actually a college professor, so he's interesting. He said, my role will change. It will not be for me to decide what to do. It will be for me to inform my constituents, give them the best information that's most up to date, make explainer videos. But then he points people to the work we're doing with Digital Democracy Project. And he's saying, you're going to tell me what to do in the mobile app, and I'm going to do it. And then you're going to hold me accountable to make sure that I do it, because we provide these scorecards at the end of the session. So I think he's gone a step further than anybody else. But I think there's 500,000 elected officials in the United States. We need 500,000 Dan Williamses, but we got to start with one.
Yeah. That is such an interesting concept because it really transforms the idea of political leadership. And it may just take the politics out of leadership. And it really is about the leadership of advocating for people and their needs and being a master communicator, I guess, if you would.
That's right.
Yeah.
I think that's
Yeah.
exactly right. And if you think about the original founder's vision, George Washington spoke at the end of his second term when he was leaving office about the risk of political parties. He was quite clear that he did not believe we should have political parties. He also believed there should be term limits. That's why he left after 2 terms. But he believed in the concept of Cincinnatus, that somebody is a member of the community who puts down the plow and goes to Washington and serves some limited period on behalf of his friends and neighbors, and then comes back and picks up the plow again. That was the original goal, I believe, and a lot of the founders spoke to that goal, even though you could argue the case about how they were effectively an oligarchy, which they were like the wealthiest members of society at the time. And in the early republic, only about 6%, when George Washington was elected, only about 6% of Americans could actually legally vote because of the property requirements. So if you look at our process of expanding suffrage over the course of 250 years, everything that we're doing is really just a natural extension of that. It is originally, most people, regardless of color, had no power to vote because they just didn't have enough money, and very few people had enough land to meet the requirements. Shortly after the founding, in the first 50 years, effectively, universal male suffrage uh, was introduced. And then obviously we had a civil war that finally gave suffrage to black voters. But then we had Jim Crow, so we went backwards. We had to fight for women's rights in the 19th Amendment. So it has been civil rights. It wasn't until a Supreme Court case in the 1950s, that Asian Americans got the right to be citizens. So we're talking, it has been a progression of hard fought gains over many, many years. And every generation of Americans, I think, has an obligation to pick up that baton and carry it that next step forward. And we're just trying to extend that inherent sense of ownership where voters own this government that is meant to be of, by, and for the people, rather than the government owning the voters, which I think has increasingly become.
Absolutely. So what is your mindset hack? How do you flip the switch? What do you do to hack your mindset?
I was actually just thinking about this yesterday, so it's good that it comes up, because it can be very stressful to try to do this, right? We're not paid for the work. We all have day jobs. We're trying to be parents. We're trying to be good citizens. We're trying to build something that can grow and that people can rely on our work. And increasingly, people are expecting things from us. So we have to put a good quality product out. Our data has to be right. Our website has to work. And all those things can cause stress. And servers cost money. Software costs money. We have to raise money. We're constantly trying to balance the books and our ambitions against our resources. So it's constantly stress. But I think one of the things that I think about is I went to college with a man named Tyler Brown, who became a lieutenant in the Army shortly after 9/11. And so he commissioned 2 years ahead of me. So he was an upperclassman. He was actually our student body president. I think about Tyler a lot because he was killed by a sniper in our Ramadi, Iraq in 2004. And when I'm in Arlington, Virginia, I can actually ride my bicycle over to see his grave. And I think that when I think about what he sacrificed so that I could be in the position to try to do something new and exciting and difficult, that's what motivates me to really say to myself, well, look, yeah, it's stressful. Sometimes it sucks, but thank God for people like Tyler who gave us the chance to try.
I get it. So now when you think about this try that you're making, what's new and next? Where do you see the project in the next year? We have elections coming. Where do you see growth? Where do you see the project going?
Well, we currently support federal legislation where all Americans can participate, whatever state they're in. We can validate them down to the U.S. House district that they live in so that they can vote on federal bills, and their district can be matched against their U.S. House member and U.S. Senator. We currently have voter files from 7 states so that we can validate people down to their state house and state senate and their local precinct so that we can do state level legislation in 7 states. Our goal is to get to all 50 states so that people can participate in their state legislation as well as their federal legislation. And eventually, I think 28 and beyond, we'd really love to be doing something at the local level and maybe piloting with some cities, some counties to do something like that where people can participate. The mobile voting technology supports it. The challenge is usually the data, getting information continuously in an automatic way about what a city is doing and how your city councilman voted, what's coming up for a vote and how they voted. That's a more challenging problem. And so we have to figure that out. But that's not a today problem. That's right now we're just trying to, I think in the next year, we just want to try to get to all 50 states at the state level legislation.
Yeah. I love that. That's realistic and manageable, right? So that's part of the balance of running an organization and building an organization. So we love to hear that. Ramon, we've talked all about this democracy project, but we know that you are a person beyond the work and the work on all these levels. So we like to know who you are when you're not working. and in your leisure time. So are you a reader, a watcher, or a listener? And what are some of your favorite reads, watches, or listens? Or what else do you do when you're off the clock?
Wow. I guess I love to think of myself as a reader, but I've increasingly become a listener because I get terrible motion sickness. So I have a hard time reading a book on a plane or in a car. So audiobooks have been my jam. And actually my son is 9 years old. And it's fun that we're now at the point where we can actually kind of listen to things together. So when we were driving from Virginia down to Florida to be with his grandparents, we've been listening to the Lord of the Rings book.
Oh, okay.
which
That's a good
which
one.
I wasn't sure he'd be down for. I mean, that's pretty dense text.
Yeah.
It's a big book. It uses some kind of difficult
Yeah.
not
Language.
old English,
Yeah.
but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's not the easiest prose. So I've been very pleased that he's enjoying listening to that, and it kind of reminds me of being a kid and listening, reading kind of science fiction books as a kid.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure it's well produced. That's one of those ones that they've produced it well. There's a little bit of,
Yeah,
production quality that makes it that much more
absolutely.
entertaining. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
they certainly
Okay.
have gotten. They've certainly gotten so good with audiobook quality now, with various people coming in and doing different voices and such. And so, yeah, it's great.
Nice. It's like it reminds you of old radio. And that's a lot
Yes,
of the reason why I love to listen, because I just love the idea of listening and creating the imagined story in my mind.
I think that's right. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but you're spot on. I mean, it's like old
Mm-hmm.
radio, the sound effects and
Mm-hmm.
the voices and the,
Mm-hmm.
yes, I
Mm-hmm.
think that's right.
Yeah. 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 Nice. So that's a good one. Check out the Lord of the Rings in audiobook. I love it.
I do a lot of podcasts as well. I do listen to a lot. I love history podcasts. So I'm
Ah.
listening to one called Empire right now, which is a fantastic podcast. That basically, the
Hmm.
beginning of the series is mostly about the British East India Company and the essentially the conquest by hook or by crook of India, of the Indian subcontinent.
Mm.
And now they've gone on to studying other empires and how empires develop and how empires fall apart. I think it's been fascinating. I would recommend that one as well.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It speaks a lot to the evolution of democracy as well, right?
Indeed. Indeed.
Yeah. 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 That's another good one. Nice. Nice tips. Those are great. So, as we draw our conversation to a close, do you have any last thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners today?
I hope that if our project is successful and we can really achieve what we would love to achieve with this work, that the next time the United States decides to go to war, everybody gets a say in that
Mm.
process.
Yeah.
We're very far from that right now, but to me, that's the real vision.
Those are great last words to leave on, considering just yesterday
Mm-hmm.
we're back on. So
That's right.
so thank you for that. Thank you for that. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your efforts. Keep up the good work. Where can we find you? How can we donate? Tell us more.
You can check out digitaldemocracyproject.org. It's a .org because we're a nonprofit. You can make donations on the page. You can also reach out to us on our social media. And if you'd love to volunteer, we would love to have your support. We need talented people who want to contribute to this mission. So please reach out to us.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. All right, Glocal citizens, this has been another episode of the podcast. You can catch us Tuesdays with new episodes at glocalcitizenspod.com or wherever you get your podcast. Please do like, share, subscribe, leave us a review. We love to hear from you. Check out our guests' socials and get involved. And as always, the show notes are rich. So again, if you didn't catch it and you're listening, you can catch it on the show notes. So until next time, bye for now.